speak to you in the name of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Today is the first day in ordinary time since the season after Christmas. Since we started Lent, we've been having readings that are thematically connected, so that each day in Lent there'd be a theme that united all three readings, and so on through Easter and then Pentecost and Trinity Sunday. And all the readings were picked for those seasons to go along with the particular theme of the day. Now that we're back in ordinary time, the readings don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, because in ordinary time, in each of the Old Testament and New Testament and Gospel readings, the lectionary just picks a spot in the Bible and starts there and then goes on from there throughout the summer. So I start by saying, let's not look for connections between the readings this morning, particularly this morning, because what we have is the story of Hagar and Ishmael, and how Abraham kicks them out into the wilderness to die. And if you're looking for some kind of theme through the readings, then you get, don't care about your family, and I come to divide mothers-in-law from daughters-in-law, and so on. And you get this picture of how God really doesn't like families, and in fact wants to split them all up. So I'm saying, let's not start our interpretive task this morning from the perspective that there must be some relationship between all three of the readings. And for me, in comparing my thoughts, I always like to take the most difficult reading to talk about, because I figure the other ones are self-explanatory. I mean, are not two sparrows sold for a penny or more worth than many sparrows? Yeah, that's fine. We get that. Great. But what about this business of Hagar? So that's where I'm going to spend some time this morning, is talking about Hagar and Ishmael. And first, for those of you that are not intimately familiar with the story, I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. Abraham and Sarah get a promise from God that Abraham is going to be a father of a great nation. And Sarah has no children. And they get older, and they get older, and still no children. Well, Abraham is a patriarch. He has many slaves and cattle and various other things. And for some inexplicable reason, Sarah says, look, I'm not getting any younger, and if we're going to have any children around here to get you started being the father of a great nation, you're going to have to get started with somebody, so here's my slave girl Hagar. And Abraham said, okay, as you do, and produced a son by Hagar, whose name was Ishmael. And then, as the story goes, this was great. It's a strong, healthy son, and Hagar started to get a little uppity. Look who can have children and look who can't. And so Sarah, of course, was still the mistress, and Hagar was still a slave, and so Sarah treated Hagar harshly. That's the expression from the Old Testament. You can fill in the blanks of what that might have looked like, of a mistress and her slave, and how to make a slave's life miserable. And so you have that story. But then, of course, the promise to Sarah comes true, and Isaac is born, and there's great rejoicing, and you have two little boys that are children of Abraham. And Sarah looks at the two boys playing together, and she says, not on my watch, and goes to her husband Abraham and says, those people have to leave. I am not sharing any inheritance with that slave girl and her rotten son. And Abraham again says, I don't know, what do you do? Well, happy wife, happy life, I guess. Off we go. So as you can imagine, Abraham and Sarah are not coming off too well in this story. And I emphasize that point, and I don't think I'm doing violence to the story in telling it this way, because when you read the story, this is in fact what happens. This is the story. And so we come to today's reading, where Hagar and Ishmael are sent in the wilderness to die. And they run out of water. They were given a canteen. Thank you very much. And off they go. Right? And then finally they run out of water, and so she puts her little son under a bush and goes off a bow shot away, because she can't bear to watch her son die. And so they're both going to die separately in the desert. And then comes to her and says, don't worry, I've got plans for you. And so they're rescue, her eyes are open, she sees a spring of water, and so on. And they do survive and they grow up. And Ishmael, in fact, becomes the father of a great nation. And so that's the turn, the pivot of the story that happens in today's reading. Now, why I want to focus on this story is because there are many, many troubling things about it. One, obviously, is the moral behavior of Abraham and Sarah, which should be offensive to anyone reading that story. The compounding that is, certainly in my books, is the interpretation that overlays the story in the Old Testament. And I have to say a word about that. In every story in the Bible, there are multiple layers to the story. There's the original events, and then there's the story that grew up around the events, and then there's the interpretation of the story that grew up around the events. And all of those layers are present in any text that we read. And so, given that the origins of this story lie back before anything was written down, we don't know what the history was that gave rise to the story. So by the time they reached the scribes that wrote it down, it had become legendary. And so the scribes, as they wrote, were writing and felt responsible to write not just the facts, but also the meaning. And so in the Old Testament, particularly in those first 5 books, the Pentateuch, you have this interpretation that everything being part of God's plan. That's the overriding interpretation of all the events. It's part of God's plan. And this leads to the next problem with the Hagar story. Because as you read it, you hear that this mistreatment of Hagar and Ishmael is all part of God's plan. And so even in today's story, when Sarah says, get rid of those two, and Abraham feels bad, God talks to Abraham and says, oh, don't worry, it's all part of my plan. And so off they go, right? And so, and I find that deeply troubling, philosophically and theologically, because it's kind of the Christian, well, it's the ancient Hebrew, it comes through in Christianity, the ancient Hebrew version of fatalism, where everything is micromanaged by God, down to the tiniest detail. And so, bringing it right home to today, this ongoing, rolling bloodbath in Syria is according to God's plan, according to that way of thinking. Because God is in charge of everything, so God is causing this to happen. There must be some reason for God to have millions of people displaced. I just read that there are now more displaced persons in the world than there have been ever since World War II. So most of them coming from Syria. Millions of people and uncounted dead. And now, of course, in the news, we've seen it spill into Iraq, and it's just getting worse. And so is our theology really that God is planning all of this for some reason? And I struggled with that because I'm a theist. I believe God is in charge. I believe there is no limit to God's authority. But at the same time, I believe in human free will. And I believe God gives us the freedom to muck it up, which we do time and time again. And so who's responsible for Syria? The people calling the shots. That's who's responsible for Syria. And God let them have the freedom of will to do that. That's God's responsibility for letting us have free will in the first place. But then what we do with it is up to us. And so Hagar's plight is on nobody's authority, nobody's responsibility other than her masters, Abraham and Sarah. It was their sin that sent Hagar into the wilderness. And that ancient interpretation where everything is of God, and so even in the Moses story where Pharaoh tortures the Hebrews and so forth, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, that's an interpretation with which I respectfully disagree. I think Pharaoh's heart turned hard all on his own because he was given the freedom to do so. And so that problem in the interpretation of the Hagar story, where God is inflicting all this punishment on Hagar for some reason, is something else which I had to wrestle. And I ended up having to say, it wasn't God who did that. It was Abraham and Sarah who did that. And what God did was make the best of a bad thing. That once they had made their choices, and the consequence of those choices were rolling out, then God came to Hagar in the wilderness and said, all right, let's make something good come even out of this. And so the implication for disasters like Syria and Afghanistan and all the rest of it is that God can, even now, say, what's done is done. there have been great evils committed and great suffering inflicted. Good can even come out of this if only you were to listen to me. That is how I see God engaging in human history and human choices, by always calling us to redeem and always creating the possibility of redemption in any situation. There's a third problem with the Hagar story that I have to share with you, and that's what the Christian tradition did with it. As if Hagar were not mistreated enough, the ancient Hebrews said, well, it's all God's plan, and then the Christians, when Paul came along, said, actually, Hagar's a great example of the way not to live, because Paul's big topic was law and grace. There's the law, which tells you what to do in this kind of prison, and then there's just freedom in God's grace, and we need to move from that intermediate step. There's the lowest step, which is just being lawless and horrible, and then the law is an intermediate step where you're told the right thing to do, and then you move on from that intermediate step into this place of grace, where you know that you don't deserve God's love and you live in this great state of freedom. And he talks about that in today's reading. But when Paul looked at Sarah and Hagar, he saw an analogy between his understanding of law and grace, and said, well, Hagar represents the law because she's in slavery and she's a hard life and so forth, and it's miserable. And Sarah represents the position of grace because it's unmerited, and she was barren and she received Isaac by grace, and so on. And so Paul draws this analogy out. And so once again, Hagar is held up as the bad example in his analogy. And Augustine picks up where Paul leaves off, because Augustine is on about the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom. And once again, Hagar represents the earthly kingdom, and Sarah represents the heavenly kingdom. And I just think, won't Hagar get any justice from our tradition? So I'm trying to do her some justice this morning. And I had to look a little beyond my own borders to find some. And so interestingly, Judaism has done some interesting things with Hagar as a figure. And you get this, this is my interpretation now. I get a sense of guilt out of the Hebrew tradition about how Hagar was treated, because there are certain rabbis, and this is by no means unanimous, but some rabbis have identified Hagar with the wife that Abraham took after Sarah died. That after Sarah died, presumably Abraham went, well, I treated her kind of badly, so I'll find her and then say, I'm sorry about what happened there. How about you be my real wife now? And she says yes, and so forth. It's a different name in the Old Testament, but the names always mean something. So the rabbis would interpret the name Hagar just to mean the stranger, and her new name meant beautiful, and so forth. So they take it as symbolic and identify the two characters. And so the Jewish rabbis have tried to find some kind of reconciliation between Abraham and Hagar at the end of Abraham or Hagar's life. In Islam, of course, Ishmael is huge. Ishmael is the answer of Muhammad. And so Islam has a number of other legends and stories about Ishmael as a character, including one about this story that we read this morning, where instead of just lying under the bush, he was a vigorous little lad and was running around. And so he panicked when he was left behind the bush and ran between two hills, back and forth. And on the seventh time, his heel struck something and a spring came out. And that's how they were saved. That's how the water happened. And to this day, when Muslims make pilgrimages to Mecca, there are two hills that some of them run between in order to reenact that scene and show the vigor of their faith, of which Ismael's young vigor is a type. And so again, there's that claiming of Hagar and Ishmael as noble ancestors within the Muslim tradition. And finally, and for me most profoundly, African Americans have claimed Hagar, particularly Hagar and Ishmael. Because think about Hagar for a minute. She's a slave. She is given a child by her master. She is cast out from her master and is a single mom trying to raise her kid in the middle of wilderness and hostility and rejection. And that is something that African American women go, yeah, we know something about that. And again, in that community, Hagar is an emblem of how God can take even the worst situation and turn it around into something good. And so I leave you with those interpretations, and I note in passing that me reaching out beyond Christianity for other views on Hagar and Ishmael's characters is another nice little tidbit for me in my journey of interpreting the story, because Hagar and Ishmael leave our pages after this story. They're part of our story, and then they're not. And the clear implication of this story is that God is doing something with Hagar and Ishmael, with people who are not part of our story. And so there's a wonderful interfaith connection in this story as well, that although they leave our pages, we know that God is doing something with Hagar and Ishmael that has its own validity and its own dignity. And so I can look over into the Muslim world, for example, and say, what is God doing with those people, with that whole group of people that have a very different pedigree and a very different understanding of ours? And so I can come at it with some openness and some curiosity, as opposed to a sense of superiority or prejudice. And so it's a lovely little interfaith parallel as well. And so I leave you with Hagar and Ishmael, rejected, abused, thrown out, and nonetheless rescued by God and integrated into God's purposes for humanity. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.